Thank you so much for tuning in to today's video, the third video, the final thing that I want to share with you that makes up this formula for meaningful modifications. Now, we already looked at the purpose of the pose and the intention of your student when it comes to providing a meaningful modification for them, and how those two things, we can go with that primary, what is the purpose of the pose, and then we can secondarily go to, well, what does my student want? We can also swap them around, and we can ask them, and we can put the ball back in their court, and we can empower them and say, well, what is it that you would like from this pose? And then we can also tie that in with, okay, well, this is generally the purpose of the pose, and this is the main feature, especially if they're not sure what it is that they want. And we can use those two things together or separately, just depending on the circumstance. Now, the final component that I want to share with you today, which makes up the formula to meaningful modifications, is to look at the context of the pose, the context of what it is that you're offering for your students, the flow, the style of the class. All of these things combined together will help you to determine just what type of meaningful modification to provide for your student. Now, what do I mean when I say context? If we were to provide our student with, let's say, a variation for downward facing dog, a variation where they might actually use the wall because their shoulders are not at a point where they're actually able to take that overhead position and load weight in that way. And we then say, okay, well, the wall is a great alternative because you can control how much of your body weight is on your hands. You're utilizing a little bit of that upper body strength. You can take the weight off when you need to because you're not upside down. And you can still get some of the benefits of back body lengthening, right? We're looking at the purpose of the pose and say they're going, yes, I want all those things, right? We're looking at the purpose. We're looking at the student's intention. But what we fail to acknowledge is the context. Is it actually helpful if we're doing and teaching downward facing dog for a couple of breaths? Is it really working for them to hop off their mat, go to the wall, do the thing, and then come back? No, that modification doesn't work within the context of the pose that you are offering. If there is a longer hold of downward facing dog, 100%, that is great. You're looking at the context of the pose and how it works within your sequence and the timing, and then you're saying, okay, we're going to be here for about 5 breaths, so it totally makes sense for them to go to the wall and use the wall for that modified downward facing dog during that time. Not if it's a quick thing. It's just cumbersome, and it doesn't really help the student because they're probably going to be spending more time walking over to the wall and walking back onto their mat, and they're probably also not going to feel super included, and they're just not really going to be inclined to want to do that. So then you've got to look at, okay, how can I provide them an alternative to downward facing dog while staying on the mat, but also not putting too much weight on the hands and getting the purpose of the pose, the back body lengthening combined with their intention, which is maybe to gradually be able to build up the weight onto the hands. How do we do that? That, again, we have to consider all of those 3 things to provide a meaningful modification for our students. Another example of this is propping the body up heavily. If you have a situation where there's just not a lot of time, then does it make sense to give your student a modification where they have to use a whole bunch of props and they set them all up, and by the time they've got it all set up, they're like, oh, everyone's moved on in the class. I've only just got myself set up here and everyone's already moved on. So it just does not make sense to provide a modification that is outside of the context of what it is that you are offering in your class and in your sequence. We've also got to look at whether something is being used as a transitionary tool. Is there a movement or a pose that's being used to transition to get from one place to the next? Or is it something that your student is going to spend a little bit more time in? So that's similar to the stuff that I've already mentioned, but the context of what you're presenting really needs to be considered to provide a modification that is actually inclusive, that is accessible, and that provides meaning for your students. Now, there is one final bonus tool that I utilize in a much more expansive way to make up this formula for meaningful modifications. And this really comes down to the accessibility component of a yoga practice. And the accessibility of a practice actually creates modifications. It creates variations, and it creates the adjustments that are necessary in order for your students to practice in a valuable way, with purpose, in alignment with their intentions, and within the context of what it is that is being offered from you as the teacher. Now, this is something that I'm going to share with you in tomorrow's video in a little bit more depth, and this comes from a very particular method that I use that is an asana adaptive method, a method to really evolve the practice of asana so it becomes a lot more easy to adapt and modify, it becomes more accessible, and therefore it becomes a lot more optimal for your students. They're going to get more benefits, and you as a teacher are going to feel a lot more confident guiding them into these things. And that really does involve the use of hands-free, less forceful options and variations and modifications of a pose. And I'm going to share with you in tomorrow's video a little bit more about that and a very special offer that I have that will help you learn and take on board this incredibly useful method. So I will share that with you in tomorrow's video. I look forward to seeing you there.